Here we are. Welcome everybody, and thank you very much for coming to our first Women in Aid and Development event for the year. It's always very exciting, and we always do it around International Women's Day. But always very pleased to see lots of faces joining us for this special one. We always think this one is quite a special one to start the year. So before we get underway, I'll do a welcome to country. So just acknowledging the traditional owners of land. We're obviously in Melbourne, we're on Wurundjeri land, and paying tribute to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and paying respects to elders past and present. Now, it might surprise people to know that International Women's Day is over 100 years old. It was first instigated in the early 1900s, I think, around 1911, something like that. And of course, was about women's equality and parity. And that obviously hasn't changed. And while societies have changed and cultures have changed and women's roles have changed, and some might say obviously gotten better from 100 years ago, certainly different, we're still curiously facing, you know, the same issues, a lot of the same core issues in terms of women's rights and equality. So it's always interesting to have this discussion to kick off our year in international development. So joining us tonight, Alice Ridge. So Alice, I will introduce. Alice is from the International Women's Development Agency. She is the Senior Research Policy and Advocacy Advisor. You could have joined us last October. We had Government Relations Policy and Advocacy as our topic. Sorry, so yes, with the agency, with the International Women's Development Agency. She leads the agency's advocacy on feminist foreign policy and funding for women's rights organisations and international development policy. She's also the founding member of the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition, which is something I want to touch on a bit later. I found that quite fascinating. And before working for the agency, you spent 5 years with ACFID, which is always going to be really interesting. So we'll look at that as well. So to start off, one of the things we like to do with Women in Aid and Development is to talk about, obviously, women in the sector. Whatever point in their career they're at, it's always interesting to know where our guest speakers came from in terms of the path they followed. And for those who have been before to our events, know that we often end up talking about the fact that the path is not linear for any of us, especially in this sector. Most jobs even, but certainly in this sector, it's never straightforward. So Alice, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And as I said, first thing I want to ask you is, how did you start out? If you could give us like an overall impression or an overview, if you like, of the path that led you to your current role in the agency in IWDA.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak. And I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're on, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So my career path, I guess I would go back to uni, where I studied politics and philosophy. I did an arts degree at Melbourne University, and I really didn't know where I wanted that to take me. I think like many young people on finishing year 12, I was like, I don't know what the world holds for me, and an arts degree is a great place to focus that energy, because I think there's, I just saw so much potential in the kinds of directions that could take me on. I did originally want to do arts law, but they stopped offering that at Melbourne University, and I wanted to move to Melbourne. So that was the reason I ditched law, which is ironic because both my parents are lawyers. My mum teaches law.
They must have been pleased.
So actually, my mum was the biggest advocate for if you're not 100% on studying law, don't do it. Like, don't do it because you think you're supposed to. So she's convinced several of my friends to drop out of law. But yeah, so I did international politics and philosophy. I really loved it, but got to the end of it and still wasn't really sure where I was going to go. Took a year off, worked in hospitality, did some travel, and then I came back and I had less than no money left, and I moved back in with my parents, and I took a volunteer role with ACFID initially. It was right after the 2013 election, which was quite catastrophic for Labor and saw the election of a lot of new MPs in coalition. And ACFID were wanting to map who were all these new MPs that had just joined Parliament, and would any of them be potentially amenable to supporting international development, because they knew they were going to need allies in the coalition, and there was quite a deep backbench. So I came in just doing that research one day a week, writing up profiles. It was fascinating because I read, maybe 100 maiden speeches of coalition MPs, which is sort of the first speech they give when they join Parliament. It usually outlines their life story, their what motivates them, why they wanted to be a member of Parliament. A shocking number of them came from families whose parents were real Aussie battlers, but they were and therefore it was such a unique and wonderful thing that they had made it to Parliament, which I think is really the story of that generation of Australians. Their parents did it really tough and worked really hard so that they could go to private school and then study law and then become a Liberal MP. So it was very super interesting way to come into the sector. And I was really lucky that an entry-level role while I was doing that voluntary work, and I was successful in getting it. And then I spent 5 years at ACFID doing different kinds of things within the policy and advocacy space. I sort of had the political background from my studies, which is what sort of got me in. And then I just kind of took opportunities to learn, increasingly really interested in the gender equality space. And so I was looking for opportunities to take on more of that kind of work while I was at ACFID, and did a little bit of further study at Flinders. They're offering a really great graduate certificate in gender mainstreaming and analysis, which I would highly recommend if anyone's interested in that space. I was able to do it online. And then I got this role with IWDA in late 2018, and so I've been there since then.
It's been very interesting through COVID.
It was.
Not just in terms of workspaces, but in terms of the context of the work you do.
Yeah, absolutely.
With projects and stuff, or certainly international rights and things like that. I was going to say, just doing the volunteer work, and we often talk about this, but doing the volunteer work, that would have been a steep learning curve doing that, like an analysis of new parliamentarians and that. That's a very steep learning curve.
Yeah,
but very
definitely.
Good. Especially if you're looking at it from the point of view of ACFID, like what they were wanting you to have a look at.
Yeah, and I think really helpful. I mean, working at ACFID was fantastic because it is a peak body. So you get a real overview of the sector and a real understanding of the different kinds of organizations, the way they work, the kinds of priorities that they have. So that was a really great way to come into the sector and to learn about it.
All right. So in terms of, being International Women's Day and what we look at, what that represents, obviously, and very much so in terms of what your role is, what would you say are the key issues affecting or impacting women and women's rights, really, today? And I know that's a very broad question, so you can pick any part of that you want, or we'll be here all night, but just basically that you see as coming to the fore, especially as far as your role is concerned.
Yeah, I mean, definitely in my role, I do a lot of work around sort of international advocacy. So looking at multilateral systems like the UN and working with kind of global feminist movements around that space. And I would say the biggest challenge that has really gotten worse in recent years is around the anti-rights movement and the way that they are really looking to wind back and erase any progress on gender equality and women's rights in international spaces, down to trying to remove the word gender from any, agreements on agriculture. They don't want to see the word gender because that represents radical gender ideology in their eyes. And And so, you know, it's not even just limited to women's rights spaces. It's now a challenge across kind of multilateral systems. And I think that there's many possible answers to your question, but that's one that's really coming up for me.
Because I was going to ask you about, is it the same issues, but there's a shift in the balance? But obviously that's where there is one. But are they the same main issues that there have been even generationally that are the key issues?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think in broad terms, issues like gender-based violence, like sexual reproductive health and rights, like workplace equality, like unpaid care, I think have existed for a long time. I mean, if we're thinking about the International Women's Day, this year is the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which was established at the World Conference on Women in 1995 in Beijing. And it's the last time that we've had a World Conference on Women, because every 5 years they think about holding another one. There'd been several up until that point. And they think about holding another one and they say, this might not be the right time to open this up. We might end up going backwards. And unfortunately,
30 years is a long time to keep doing that every 5 years.
It is. It's a really long time, but I think it's, unfortunately, I think that's been true at every moment. We would have gone backwards. And so I think, you know, that the Beijing Declaration has 12 critical areas of action. Many of them resonate really strongly today, around GBV, around the economy. There are areas that I think, like gender and climate change, that have significantly, you know, the world much more deeply understands now than we did in 1995. Obviously, technology was a nascent area, but now is coming up in so many different ways. But yeah, I think that to bring it back to this point around anti-rights movements, I think, you know, it is deeply distressing that the high watermark for global agreements on women's rights is now 30 years ago. And I think really points to the way that things have kind of fractured in the past few decades.
Okay, so is there given that, and like you say, there's the emergence of some new issues, e.g. climate change, and that, have we actually made any progress? Is there any progress being made in any significant way on any of them to try and put a bit of a positive light on it?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Like, I think in some ways backlash is, you know, I don't want to say that it's just a response to progress. I think it's its own agenda, but it is also a response to progress. Like, if we think about the change in LGBT rights and the understanding of LGBT issues in, you know, even the past 5-10 years is huge. And so I think that there are absolutely areas where we have seen progress. I think it looks different in different contexts. You know, some countries will have seen more progress on workforce participation compared to GBV, or compared to women in particular industries, or compared to sexual and reproductive health rights. But yeah, I mean, I think there's absolutely areas of progress within that. And I think that there's also really incredible work that's being done by feminist movements all the time. You know?
Okay. One of the things that has been raised, and I've mentioned it to you earlier, that we're, I don't know whether to do USAID now or not, it's been raised as an issue, and I know questions have been asked, so we might as well front that one. It's the elephant in the room, really. As I said, what we did this time was that we put out requests, or basically requests to say if anyone had a question they wanted to ask, depending on what city they were in and who the guest speakers were. We got 3 for Melbourne, and they were all about USAID, the impact. So yes, and that was something I was going to bring up anyway. So obviously, one of the big questions is, well, there are several, but let's have a look at the impact, obviously, of what the US government's done, of what's happened to the situation around USAID and other international aid budgets, what's happening in the development sector, and how do we move through this, given what's happening, or do we still have to wait and see what the consequences are? It must have had a major impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think the impact is huge. And I have some notes here because I was presenting on this on the weekend. I think the USAID stop work order is really significant because I think it shifts the parameters of what is possible. You know, we've seen aid cuts before. Again, when I was working at ACFID in, I think 2014 or 2015, the government cut the aid program by 20%.
Yeah.
That was huge. That was a massive impact on the sector. You know, this is it's not entirely clear. It's at least 90% of funding has stopped. And I would say a significant proportion of that will not restart. And it stopped overnight. And that is so incredibly disruptive, both in the immediate impacts, but also in kind of the ripple effects. So all of those organizations that have lost all of their funding are now competing against the rest of the organizations for a smaller pool of funds. You know, it means that, there are just so many gaps to be filled. And I think the significant change since Trump came in 2016, and, you know, at that point, he reinstituted what's called the global gag rule, which targets, prevents US aid money going to organizations that provide referrals, well, certainly services, but even referrals or advocacy around abortion. And he expanded the remit of that rule in 2016. So it impacted a whole range of additional organizations. And back then we saw donors like the Netherlands, like Sweden, coming in to fill that gap. They have also made massive cuts in the past few years. So Sweden has cut by, you know, closer to 20%. The Netherlands are aiming to cut by 2/3 by the end of 2027. And they are, if not entirely removing gender equality as a priority, significantly reducing the focus. And they used to be the top donor to women's rights organizations.
Have they given reasons for this sort of move? It seems unusual in terms of, probably somewhat stereotypically, but the way we think of those areas of Europe, certainly, and globally in terms of those areas, in terms of social change and contributing to that. Reasons for it?
Yeah, so both Sweden and the Netherlands and a number of other countries have elected far-right governments. They tend to have like those coalition governing models where they elect a number of parties who then negotiate amongst themselves. So it's not that the party that won the most votes is a far-right party, but they're in the mix and they hold a lot of power in those negotiations. And one of the things they've gone after is international development. And gender. Sweden had a feminist foreign policy, which I know we'll come to, and one of the first things they did was to axe that policy. I think what's driving it is a lot of, despite the fact that they're quite sort of economically progressive countries, they have really high taxation, and really strong social services, they're also quite protectionist, and I think go as far to say racist, in that it's a sense of like, yeah, good services for us. We'll pay high taxes for us. And there's been a huge wave of immigration, you know, caused by a history of colonialism and imperialism and all these things that Europe has been part of. But a huge wave of immigration, which then triggers populist rhetoric and anti-immigration and racist rhetoric, and then it makes it then really easy to cut aid and to divert most of it to try and stop migration. So it's actually IWDA lost all of our funding from the Netherlands government quite a few years ago now, because they were one of our biggest donors, funding organizations across Asia and the Pacific, and they pulled that funding in an extremely political decision to redirect their focus to Africa, because that's where migrants come from in Europe. And the sort of geopolitical justification for aid was the only thing keeping it going, and that was under the progressive government. So with then right-wing governments coming in, it's a really challenging situation. I think the other thing in Europe is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is really destabilizing the sense of security that European countries had. So they're reinvesting a lot in defense, and they're also redirecting aid to Ukraine. So even, Sweden, it's a much smaller cut in real terms, but so much of that money is being redirected to Ukraine.
Well, yeah, and especially even this week, I heard yesterday that there was I can't remember, it wasn't Poland or Germany, was putting their defence budget up to something like 4%, which is unusual. So purely because of the situation in Europe, and now with what's going on with the US government, Europe's deciding that they all need to actually stand up and spend way more on defence, because they're not going to be supposedly able to rely on the bigger ally.
Yeah, and the
So,
irony, of course, is like gender equality is the biggest predictor of peace.
Yeah.
So it's crazy to pull money out of gender equality and put it into defence. And you're going to need it in defence because you've stopped funding gender.
So, I mean, you were talking about obviously the early 2013, 2014, 2015, where the Australian government changed the coalition, and they were pretty much decimating our foreign aid budget. Since the change of government a couple of years ago, they have tried to claw some of that back. Aside from the fact we've got another election coming up, what do you think, what do you expect, or has there been any indication of what the Australian government, what Australia within the development sector, as it were, would do to perhaps countermand what's going on with USAID and those other cuts you were mentioning, sort of thing? Is it looking like they're going to do anything, or are they attempting to do anything? And again, this is, forget the fact that there's an election. Let's assume we're rolling on.
Sure. I mean, I would love to know. I'm trying to figure that out. Penny Wong spoke about this at Senate estimates last week. She was asked about the impact of the USAID stop work order and whether Australia would be filling the gap. She was very clear that Australia doesn't have the resources to entirely fill the gap, even just in the Pacific. But they're clearly tracking it. The other thing I would say that is really significant is that the Foreign Minister launched the International Gender Equality Strategy within 2 weeks of the Trump inauguration, and in the same week that the USAID stop work order was coming into effect. And he was making all these executive orders on there are only 2 genders now, DEI programs don't exist, we're cutting this no longer is a thing. Like, just all of these sweeping decisions coming out of the States. And I think it was really significant that they went ahead with launching that strategy. Just from a political perspective, there would have been a lot of reasons not to go ahead with that launch. And so I do, there are some areas of the strategy that I think are really strong. There are some areas I think could have been stronger. But I think the fact that they went ahead is really significant and does demonstrate that there's an ongoing commitment to gender equality in international development, even in the face of, Australia's biggest ally really walking away from that.
So what are, I mean, in terms of giving people a sense, and I'm sure everyone can imagine to a great degree, but the breadth of the impact of shutdowns or axing of funding like this, it's everything from small NGOs or even some CSOs, but also just employment as well as actual projects, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are thousands of people who have lost jobs, many programs that have been shut off overnight. So yeah, I mean, I think the effects are really wide reaching. I think what's been interesting is that the discussion that I've seen coming out of women in the global south, or what we call the majority world, has been different to the discussion that's happening in the US and that's happening in sort of the larger international NGO space, where there's a lot of mourning of what's being broken apart, and I think fair enough, it's a
well, that would be the most impacted. Global South's going to be the most impacted by this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the what's been really interesting is that there's been people calling for let's not just try to fight to keep what we have. We actually know it wasn't working super well. It's a very colonial institution. The funding wasn't accessible to many local organizations. A lot of it goes to intermediaries. At IWDA, we didn't take US unpaid funding because of the global gag rule, because we are a pro-choice organization. We don't fund any partners who provide abortion services, but we certainly see it as a fundamental human right. And so, you know, there are many women's rights organizations that were already excluded from that funding. And so this sense of, yes, absolutely no one would have wanted it to be done this way, but let's also not, I guess, glorify a system that wasn't actually working for a lot of people, and really look at, if we're advocating for something to be built in its place, what would that look like, and how would that actually, you know, serve the people that it's meant to.
So are there options coming out of the global south, or is it too early to tell in terms of the sort of like anyone standing up or trying to address that impact in a positive way, whether it be through funding or any other way? And is that at government level, or is that NGOs pulling?
Yeah, I mean, I think I see it at like the civil society level. I think the conversations about what does it look like to do development differently have really been driven out of civil society. I think governments have been really limited by their risk appetite, and a really low risk appetite, and what I would say is a misplaced sense of risk. They're more interested in the risk of fraud than they are in the risk of not funding women's rights organizations, which I think is huge. And I think the risk is you end up with fascist authoritarian governments if you don't fund women's rights organizations, if you don't fund civil society. I think the risks are enormous, but they're less direct, and they don't play as well. You know, you don't get a media story about that in the way that you might with a fraud scandal or something. So,
okay. I mentioned to you earlier, excuse me for doing this, because I was saying to Alice, next week, I hope I get this right. So next week is based on the Beijing, the 30th anniversary of Beijing, of that declaration, the power of regional movements and strategy, advancing the Beijing platform for action through feminist foreign policy, which, as I said to Alice, is right up her street. And this is a gathering being conducted by the UN. So I was half expecting her to have to fly off to New York, but she says, no, she's not going. There's another team going. What for this, as you said, they haven't repeated it after 30 years. They haven't done another sort of session, as it were. What is the hope of having a gathering like this and looking at those issues, especially, you know, obviously following on from International Women's Day as part of that whole discussion? What is it that when we have a big event like this, and obviously the UN's operating it, people are coming from around the world, what are they hoping to get out of it, given the situation that we now sit in?
Yeah. So that event is happening as part of the Commission on the Status of Women, which happens every year in New York. At least it has so far. We will see if New York continues to be the venue. I can certainly see some arguments for holding it somewhere else. And it is sort of the UN mechanism to monitor progress on the Beijing platform. So it happens every year. Usually there's a thematic focus area like GBV, like climate change. But this year, every 5 years, it focuses on, at a more high level, review of progress against the whole of the Beijing agenda. I think this year it will be a lot of feminist movement strategizing about what do we do now. And the event that you mentioned, with a focus on regionalizing feminist foreign policy, is one that we've been co-organizing with partners who work in the feminist foreign policy space. And it builds from an event that I was part of in Bangkok in November, which was part of the regional lead-in meeting to CSW. So they hold regional meetings in all the different regions of the world in the lead up to that global meeting every year. And we had a conversation there on the potential for feminist foreign policy in Asia and the Pacific, which is a region that's really, you know, feminist foreign policy discussions are really nascent. And so this global conversation about regionalizing the agenda is partly in reference to the fact that we have seen governments like Sweden, which was the first country to adopt feminist foreign policy 10 years ago, and the Netherlands walk away from those commitments.
It's just so surprising. Well, not if they had a change of government, but yeah.
Yeah, so the feminist foreign policy, sort of there's sort of up to 15 countries that have formally adopted that approach at some point in time. Not all of them still do, like Sweden and the Netherlands. And some of them made an announcement that didn't particularly go anywhere. And then others who've expressed a lot of interest but haven't made a formal commitment. And I think what is interesting is the first wave were dominated in sort of Europe and Canada, with Mexico sort of being the exception of a global South country adopting feminist foreign policy. The sort of second wave have been much more diverse. So we've seen countries like Liberia, quite a few countries in Latin America, so Chile, Colombia, briefly Argentina, right before their change of government. Committing to feminist foreign policies and sort of taking a really different approach to that in a way that was really interesting and kind of challenging that it was a European sort of Eurocentric idea. And I think particularly with this shift to the right and away from commitment to feminism and gender equality, it's a really interesting time to be looking at the potential of this agenda in other parts of the world, and a sense of sort of reclaiming it. You know, it's not just what governments do with feminist foreign policy, but it's actually a practice that's being employed by feminist movements around the world all the time. And it's a lens of analysis that we can bring to government's foreign policy, even when they haven't made a commitment to take that approach. We can say, we're assessing you against that standard and you're falling short. Which maybe links a little bit to what we're doing in Australia. So, yeah.
I was going to ask you that because obviously in introducing you, I mentioned the fact that you were one of the founding members of the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition. So did that come from, obviously as a founding member, an interest in what was being done in the rest of the world, or were we also part of the initial drive? How did that work?
Yeah, so it was something that we were seeing, countries in other parts of the world take up, and that we thought held a lot of potential for Australia. I mean, Australia, certainly in the development space, has consistently prioritized gender equality, even under previous governments. And it's something that we had been advocating for in the Australian context for a couple of years at that point. And we did a piece of research in 2020 looking at trying to understand the pathways that governments who had feminist foreign policies had taken to getting there. So sort of understanding what was the political process behind that. And one of the things that really stood out to us was that there was a really important role for civil society in creating an enabling environment. So in kind of bringing feminist ideas from sort of a fringe concept to something that was really taken seriously by policymakers.
Okay.
And so I think we were sort of part of the role of the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition was to get more diverse people talking about it. It's one thing when it comes from IWDA, the government can say, that's great, you're the feminists, love your energy, but that's really nice for you to talk about. But it's quite different if you have, the Asia Pacific Defence Diplomacy Development Dialogue talking about feminist foreign policy. That carries a really different weight. And I think we wanted to sort of tap into our broader networks and the range of people we knew were seeing potential in this idea. To really to bring it forward as something that was a reasonable or in quotes, reasonable policy option for Australia.
So have you had discussions or relations with AP4D and doing things with them?
Yeah, so Melissa is part of our steering committee for
I'm not surprised.
AFFPC. There's lots of overlap.
She's got a finger in so many pies.
Yeah, all these good people are always overlapping different committees, and I've been part of a couple of their dialogue processes and reports. Yeah. Which has been really fantastic and really interesting.
It is, yeah.
The first one that I participated in, I was sort of raising feminist foreign policy, maybe we could make a recommendation there, what do people think, and really not knowing how it would land. And there was much more openness than I was anticipating.
So I was going to ask, with the coalition, so in terms of your links or your dialogue with government, I'm assuming you take the form of, I guess, like a think tank in some respects. So using an organisation or whatever you want to call it, a combination, or an organisation like AP4D Does that help you, or had you already been able to make connections with the government
Yeah, so I mean, we've had ongoing
in terms of policy and
conversations.
things? Yeah.
Ongoing conversations with government. We had a couple of conversations with Senator Wong when she was in opposition, and sort of exploring what her approach to the foreign ministry would be. We had some really interesting conversations, and she invited us to set up a round table with a couple of the key members of that coalition right before the election 3 years ago now, which was really great. And one of the things we talked about there was the links between feminist and First Nations foreign policy.
Okay.
And we've subsequently done a whole podcast on that topic, which I'd really encourage you to listen to if you haven't come across it. It's called Effort. And the tagline is exploring feminist and First Nations approaches to foreign policy. And from what we've heard, that discussion was one of the things that got her over the line to announcing the First Nations foreign policy approach.
So there is a sense you're being listened to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think with Senator Wong, I think interestingly, while I think there's a lot of sort of values alignment at a personal level, I think part of her, she obviously carries a lot of identities in her role, and being a woman of color, being a queer woman, and wanting to sense how those aspects of her identity would play out in her relationship with leaders of other countries. I think she thought feminist would be another challenging identity to bring into the mix. She had quite a few already. And the First Nations agenda was something that resonated really strongly in the Pacific and in the context of the voice referendum, which obviously wasn't successful, but was something that there was an effort underway in the lead up to that to see how it applied in all of the kind of portfolio areas. And that was the way that they were bringing it forward in Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So yeah, really good conversations with government. And then we also had, were consulted on the development of the International Gender Equality Strategy and the development framework. So had some opportunities to input there. So I think like they haven't taken the label of feminist foreign policy. That's pretty crystal clear. And they warned us that that would be the case. But I think what we've been able to do is to bring a lot of the elements and principles of that into so just be taken much more seriously, and in some cases,
so they've actually adapted to or adopted it to some degree, but just without giving it the title you'd prefer it to be given. They're doing it in a quieter or more subtle way. But at least they're looking at it.
Which is quite interesting because we updated that research recently last year, looking at the kind of second wave of countries adopting feminist foreign policies, and also the fact that some governments were doing away with it. And part of the challenge, I think, is that the label of feminist, it does set a really bold, transformative agenda, which is a real strength, because, you know, if you don't say you're going to do something bold and disruptive, you are very unlikely to do it. But at the same time, it does put a target on that policy. And what is really challenging is where governments had said they were going to take a really bold, transformative agenda, and then they kind of just carried on what they were already doing. The target then becomes what you were already doing. And so you're risking all of these policy areas like girls' education that have previously been totally uncontroversial start to get attached to the label of feminism in a way that can be challenging. So it's not what we had pushed for, but I also think it's going to be quite interesting to see what happens over the next couple of years, including if we go through a change of government, what might happen with kind of a more like under the radar approach. Yeah,
very true. So we'll get some questions shortly, but first I'll just finish up. I wanted to finish up in terms of looking at some more positive aspects, if I can put it that way, given all the different things that are going on at the moment. So positive aspects of the sort of work being done by yourself and by the agency, by WDA, for women in the sector. What are some of the perhaps activities, projects that the work that's being done like I say, at the agency, that you're seeing some forward movement, keeping
Yeah.
in mind that the theme for this year's International Women's Day is March Forward or Accelerate Action. What you know, I mean, I'm assuming there are some forward steps happening with some things, some projects that you're feeling positive or happy about.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe I haven't talked a lot about the work that our partners do, which is obviously really important to the organisation. So we fund a range of organisations across Asia and the Pacific, and to do all kinds of work. Some of it's sort of service delivery, running shelters for women, running leadership programs. Some of it is advocacy, like engaging in UN spaces, like when we go to CSW, when we go to regional meetings, our partners are there doing similar work. In the one that I would speak to is in the Solomon Islands. Our partner, RAM, the Women's Rights Action Movement, have been advocating over a long time now for something called temporary special measures, which is basically quotas in Parliament. It's a provision under CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So it's sort of this provision in international law that allows you to positively discriminate in favour of women. And they have been advocating to bring in temporary special measures, or TSMs, into their Parliament because they have extremely low representation of women, like
it's fairly common in the Pacific.
1 or 2 women in their Parliament. And so we've been supporting that work over a number of years, and they've had some really major setbacks, like losing all their funding, I believe twice. And right in the middle of their campaign, they had just fulfilled the criteria that had been set by the National Parliament, which was to go out and get the support of all the provincial parliaments. They just met that criteria, and the situation changed, and they basically had to start from scratch and rebuild all of that buy-in and redo a number of years worth of work. But they've really persistently and very, with a really sophisticated campaign, using research, using community discussions and dialogues, and using direct advocacy to provincial and national parliament. They have been able to get that agreement for temporary special measures in the federal parliament. So, I think there's still some hurdles to overcome before it's fully in place, but it's been, I guess, like a really great story of persistence of feminist organizations and the real smarts and kind of strategic nature of the way that they work to utilize something that's coming from international law, then really because they're part of that community, they understand how people think, they understand how people view quotas, how they view women and men in the community, what some of the unintended consequences for women might be with taking an approach like that. And so they've been, just really impressive in their advocacy.
Yeah, which is good, because it's not an easy ask in the Pacific at all, any of the Pacific nations, which are generally spread across very different areas in terms of the number of islands and villages, urban and rural, regional, that sort of thing. Very, very difficult ask to get to all of them in terms of putting women forward for empowerment. Thank you very much for the discussion. We will have questions shortly, but I just wanted to say thank you. I'm going to give you a little, this is what we like to do, Women in Aid and Development, a little gift. It's a Women in Aid and Development mug.
Amazing, thank you.
And these are,
I'll look forward to it.
These are very select. Only, I guess, speakers get these. So they're very rare.